History tells us of many revolutions. For example, the French Revolution did not just overthrow a king. It shattered the sanctity of kings. It destroyed the privileges of the nobility. It tore down the order of centuries and replaced it with something new: equality, citizenship, the nation. The very codes of the modern world were written on those barricades. Or the Soviet Revolution. It didn't just overthrow a czar. It targeted property, class, and the entirety of the old order. For the first time in history, a complete alternative to the existing world order was established. Half of the 20th century was shaped under the shadow of that red flag. These two revolutions did not merely change the hands of power. They overthrew an entire system, not just a ruler. 1,000 years ago, such a revolution took place in the Islamic world as well. Most people mistake it for a simple change of dynasties. The Umayyads fell, and the Abbasids came. But what happened was far greater than that. Because the Abbasids did not just overthrow a family, they overthrew an entire order. And the collapse of that order would completely alter the destiny of the Islamic world. The Umayyads were now ruling a massive empire, a world stretching from the shores of the Atlantic to the steppes of Central Asia. At the center of this world stood Damascus. The power that built this empire was clear: the conquerors, the tribes, the Arab warrior aristocracy. This class formed the very backbone of the state. But as the empire expanded, a new problem emerged. Millions of people living in the conquered territories began converting to Islam. Persians, Berbers, Turks, the peoples of Transoxiana. In theory, they were all part of the Ummah. But in practice, the situation was different. Arabs were at the center of the state, while other Muslims were often relegated to the background. They were called mawali. There was an ever-widening gap between Islam's promise of equality and the reality of the empire. The empire was growing, but the political order carrying it remained the same. On one side was the privileged center, on the other, an ever-expanding periphery. And as has happened many times in history, the very forces keeping an order alive began to produce the forces that would destroy it. But where would this anger flow? A center was needed, a place where the explosion would begin. And that place was not the heart of the empire, it was its most distant edge, Khorasan. Today's eastern Iran, the threshold of Central Asia, thousands of kilometers away from Damascus. But what made Khorasan dangerous was not its distance. Here, the empire was no longer a single piece. There was a layered life. Arabs had intertwined with the local population. They had lived together, married and blended. The Arab in Khorasan was no longer like the Arab in Damascus. The rigid identity of the center was dissolving here. Arab and mawali, the conqueror and the conquered. While this distinction was clear-cut in Damascus, it was blurred in Khorasan. And precisely because of this, the injustice of the center was felt more nakedly here. It was in these lands that silently something began to be woven. Its name was Dawa, the call. But this was no ordinary call. Not an organization, but a network. Not a state, but an invitation. A structure working underground for years was established. Representatives were sent to regions. People were chosen one by one. Money was collected under the table, and the bonds were silently woven. And this entire network gathered around a single sentence: Al-Rida min Ali Muhammad, the chosen one from the house of Muhammad, who will be agreed upon. The sentence was powerful because it carried both a religious promise and created a political vacuum. But most importantly, there was no specific name. It wasn't said who it was. And this was not a flaw, it was a conscious strategy. Because a name limits a movement, whereas ambiguity makes it grow. This sentence echoed differently across Khorasan. For a peasant, it meant justice. For a Persian, it meant equality. For a Shia, it was the lineage of Ali. But in reality, they were all looking into the same void. And that void was expanding, because in history, expectations always spread faster than names. But a movement does not march on a sentence alone. It also requires a hand to carry that sentence, someone to stand on the field. And that man emerged from an unexpected place. His name, or the name he was known by, was Abu Muslim al-Khorasani. So who was this man? Here lies one of the strangest aspects of history. We know almost nothing about the person who led such a massive movement. Was he an Arab or a Persian? We don't know. Was he born a slave or a free man? We don't know. What was his real name? We don't even know that. Sources conflict, accounts contradict each other. It is as if history intentionally left this man in the fog. But perhaps this was no coincidence. Perhaps, just like the nameless call he fought for, Abu Muslim himself was a kind of void. A figure with no clear identity, upon whom everyone could project their own meaning. The call was nameless, and so was the man carrying it. Young, ordinary-looking, but an extraordinary organizer. They sent him to Khorasan because the brains were in Iraq, but the real power was not there. The real gunpowder had accumulated in Khorasan, and Abu Muslim sat right on top of that gunpowder. He waited patiently, tightened the bonds, organized the men. Then, in the year 747, the signal was given, and a color rose over Khorasan. Black. The black flags were unfurled. The year 749. The network that had been woven underground for years was no longer hiding. The network established by the dyers began to move openly for the first time. Secret meetings came to an end. Whispers gave way to open proclamations. People who had known each other for years went into action at the exact same time. News delivered in one village found an echo in another city. A flag raised in one region gathered new supporters in another. Now, the underground structure had become visible, and subsequently, the armies of Khorasan began to march west. Yet, it wasn't just soldiers advancing. Their news arrived before them. Their supporters arrived before them. The relationships built over years arrived before them. Because of this, in many places, the gates were not opened by force. They were opened from within. In many places, the balances shifted before the battle even began, because the movement was not new. It was simply no longer concealing itself. They set out from Merv, from the heart of Khorasan, from the easternmost edge of the empire, and they had only one direction before them, west toward the center. First, they reached Nishapur. Then they crossed the mountains and descended into Ray, right next to modern-day Tehran, the gateway to the Iranian plateau. When Ray fell, the gate between east and west swung open. The march continued. They crossed the Zagros passes, Hamadan, Nihavend, the very lands where the Sasanian Empire had collapsed a century ago. Now the same roads were witnessing the end of another empire. They descended from the mountains, and the plains of Iraq opened up before them. The wealthiest, most populous, and most strategic region of the empire, because whoever held Iraq held the center. and in the heart of Iraq there was a city, Kufa. For years, the city of discontent, of opposition, of waiting. As the black flags approached, the city was already stirring. Kufa rose up before the flags even arrived. The gates were not forced from the outside, they were opened from within. By the end of the year, 749, Kufa was captured. Now, the matter was no longer a provincial movement. The march that started in the east had reached the heart of the empire. And at that moment, everyone knew the same thing. The outcome of this war would no longer be decided in Damascus, but on the field. Only one thing remained: to defeat the last caliph of the Umayyads. And he, up north, on the banks of a river, was preparing to test his fate one last time. And that river was the Zab, the year 750. The final act of the empire was now opening here. The Umayyad army gathered all its remaining strength. This was no longer a campaign. It was a battle for survival. Facing them was the march that had begun in Khorasan. No longer a provincial movement, but a force that had advanced deep into the empire. The two armies clashed on the banks of the great Zab River. When the battle began, it wasn't just about swords. It was about who an entire order could be built around. The Umayyad side still carried the weight of the old center, but that weight was now fractured. The Khorasanis, however, moved as a single line. A network bound together for yours was now on the battlefield at the exact same time. The clash was brief, but what decided the outcome was not its duration. It was who possessed the discipline of order. The Umayyad army collapsed, shattered. Even the retreat was not unified. An empire was fracturing on the field, and on the riverbank, a clear truth remained. This battle was not a mere struggle for power. It was the end of a regime. After the great Zab, the road was wide open. Damascus was no longer a defensible center. It was merely a capital waiting to fall. And those advancing westward knew this because they no longer faced an army, but a collapsed order. And so, in the year 750, the revolution was complete. The Umayyads fell, and the Abbasids came. A 90-year-old order was demolished, replaced by a new one. But let us return to the question at the beginning. Was this truly just a change of dynasties? No. Because what was destroyed was not a family. What was destroyed was the very way the world functioned. On one side was the old order based on conquest, blood, and tribal solidarity, Asabiyya. On the other side was a new balance that gathered different peoples from the periphery of the East under the same roof. The revolution did not just change the throne, it changed who could hold power. The center no longer belonged to a single tribe. And precisely because of this, the Abbasid Revolution, just like the French Revolution or the Soviet Revolution, was not merely a struggle for power. It was the end of one order and the birth of another, one of the quietest yet deepest fractures in history.